But let's talk a little bit about Cosmos and integration. Kepler, I think, was just integrated today on THORChain, at least, or THORSwap, at least when I saw it, I saw it's possible. So what does this integration mean? I know a lot of like cosmonauts, they're very much, IBC maxis in that sense. They say like, IBC needs to get implemented everywhere. You, as of my knowledge, at THORChain, you don't have it implemented yet. I don't know if there are plans to implement it. How do you view that, and what does this integration of Atom in THORChain mean for the rest of Cosmos?
I think having an entry point and an exit point from that Cosmos ecosystem without centralization or asking permission or centralization that can happen is like critically important to any ecosystem, and Cosmos is no different in this sense. So being able to trade layer 1 Bitcoin with Atom, or layer 1 Bitcoin with Osmo or Juno, or like, insert favorite coin here, is like a critical thing that every ecosystem should have, right? Having such a mechanism to get to one stable coin to another or one asset to another is like, inarguable, something that every ecosystem should have. And so by accomplishing it here, we're just empowering the Cosmos ecosystem to have access to more assets and trade more freely with more liberty and more self-sovereignty than they've effectively had before.
But do you think that this kind of like makes an implementation of IBC, at least like natively on a THORChain protocol, unnecessary at this point? Or do you think at one point, or even now, are there like plans to implement it, or is that really not really necessary from your standpoint?
Yeah, we've looked at IBC on and off several times. There have been points when I was very excited about it, and there's points when I was not very excited about it as implementation. We have a different design requirements than what IBC implements, right? And so the way that I think I'm looking at it these days is that if you think about Uniswap and Sushi and Osmosis and like these kinds of dexes as ways of moving around within a specific ecosystem, right? Kind of like a driver's license to drive between state to state. And then you need, a passport to get across, countries, from going to the United States to Europe or something like this. And THORChain is like probably going to be more like a passport than a driver's license, right? And so being able to swap, for example, from Juno to Osmo to, Atom maybe or whatever, and then send the Atom through THORChain to Ether, and the Ether gets sent to, 1inch, and 1inch swaps it to Link. And there was a bunch of transactions that occurred there, but from your perspective, you just sent the Juno in, right? And so like in a single transaction from your perspective, and not having to pay gas all along the way or hold many wallets along the way or any of these kind of things, is just like a critically important and hugely important thing for the entire industry. So I think like what may end up happening, and I'm not a future, I don't have a crystal ball, is that like we'll utilize, exchanges within Cosmos, like Osmosis, for example, or maybe Gravity Dex or whatever's coming downstream, to trade within that ecosystem using IBC to kind of teleport around. And then when you want to exit those systems, I think THORChain will play the best way to do so.
Would there be like, so from what I understand it, IBC would not be completely necessary to make THORChain a success, and obviously it isn't at this point right now. But would it have any like downsides? Or because I'm also thinking like the Rune coin, wouldn't it be beneficial to have also Rune liquidity on other Cosmos dexes, for example? Or could you also do that without IBC? Or
no? So with opening up IBC opens up some new things that have to be considered, right? And that is, so for example, in THORChain's case, like large transactions get delayed, what we call delayed outbounds, to give the community and the network time to respond to some sort of exploit or attack that's happening on the network, so that we ensure that all the liquidity on the network is safe, right? And so right now, the swapping to a Rune asset has no delay because there's no exit other than centralized exchanges. And if you're hacking THORChain and you're stealing Rune, you're not going to exit through Coinbase because you're doxing yourself a whole long way. If you open it up to an IBC thing where you can instantly transfer to another chain, that becomes an exit point for making an attack on THORChain more economically feasible, which is something we may not be interested in being exposed to that. In addition to that, some of the design aspects of IBC just doesn't match kind of the ethos of how we designed our bridge. For example, you know, an IBC relayer will probably, one will most of the time exist, maybe two possibly, and be a point of centralization, right? In terms of like, we've seen this before where certain, you know, IBC bridges broke for hours because some single individual broke their, you know, their relayer or whatever. That's actually happened in the past, and that's something that we kind of like want to position ourselves for in a sense. Another thing is that like IBC relayers are not incentivized, right? They're doing it purely through altruistic purposes, and they're paying gas as they transact all along the way. And right now, they're just being, you know, paid for by, you know, somebody, a foundation typically, or something like this, which is just not aligned to the ethos of what we want to do in terms of getting towards full decentralization. So I was very excited about IBC in the earliest days, and I was very excited to integrate it and using it personally. But the more I learned about its design implementation, not to rip it apart, not to tell them like it's a bad design or any of these things, that's not what I'm saying. Only that it didn't actually meet the design requirements that we have for what we're trying to accomplish as a project. And so it wasn't a good fit. Now, if I build another Cosmos project, which I probably will do at some point in my life, I will probably interface with IBC. It'll be a great use case for it. Like, I'm not saying it's a bad technology or anything like that. It just didn't match for what we needed to do for us.
Dimi is saying in the chat, if you're concerned about IBC relays, we can talk about it. He's from the Core 1 team in Juno and Stakefish. So, yeah, but I think like, yeah, I don't know. I think you've also.
I mean, I've had several conversations. Like, I've had several conversations with many people within the IBC dev community. Like, I think I've probably had at least 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 conversations with different individuals at different points, and I've gone through it all many times. And every time I said it, I'm like, there must be something that I'm missing that I'm not getting. And every time I dive deeper into it, I'm like, no, this is actually how it's designed, and that's okay, but it just doesn't match for what we need in this project.
Maybe not yet. Maybe in the future.
Maybe not yet. No, that's actually a fair point. Like, none of these things that I'm talking about are like fundamental problems with IBC. All of these things can be changed and improved. Like, they could have the relayers be built into the validators themselves, and then every time that a block is proposed by one of the validators, they're also the ones that's doing the relaying. If you were to do that, you would to completely just decentralize the idea of a IBC relayer. But that's perfectly fine. Like, you don't have to build a project like IBC, for example, and be completely decentralized day one. That's not actually a requirement for any project in this space at all. It's okay to start somewhat centralized in the beginning and then have a pathway to decentralization. But what's most important about that is having a pathway to decentralization. And many projects don't have that. But IBC totally does have that. It can totally become much more decentralized in the way it is now. That is completely possible. And I have every faith in comments that it will become that. But it's just not what it is today.
If I can jump in just for a second, super interesting discussion. I think what matters the most to a user who's asking about IBC is, hey, am I going to be able to use my asset on the Cosmos chain and connect it through to what THORChain is doing? And the answer to that is yes. We can do that through DEX aggregation. So by just adding the Atom pool, which is going live within a few days here on THORChain, you can use IBC combined with THORChain through DEX aggregation, and then move from any of those Cosmo chains into any of the other THORChain chains, or vice versa. So IBC can still play a really important role there in the swapping of assets, and without THORChain needing to necessarily interface with it directly.
Yep, very true.
But it would only count for Atom, right? For whatever you have vaults implemented.
So you could start with Atom, but like if we were to integrate, for example, with Osmosis, from that point, you could do you can probably use like chain accounts, for example, to be able to take a complicated set of transactions of like relaying it over here and then doing a swap and then relaying to the Atom and then swapping the Atom, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's all possible and feasible from a technological perspective. So I agree with what Morgaki was just saying a second ago, that we don't have to integrate with every Cosmos chain underneath the sun or try to replicate all the connections that IBC is already making. We're not trying to compete with IBC. We're not trying to tear it down or any of this. Like, we're trying to contribute to the space. IBC is trying to contribute to the space. Like, we're both heading in the same direction, helping each other to accomplish what each other's trying to do. So we shouldn't have this negative perspective that that it's this or that, right? It's not a Boolean thing. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah.